The cardinal was on his knees in the dark, and the woman in front of him was not the Queen of France. He did not yet know this. He knew only that the white muslin of her gown caught the moonlight where it fell through the trellis of the Bosquet de Venus, that her hand had been offered to him to kiss, that a rose had been pressed into his palm. "You may hope," she whispered, in a voice that he had been listening for since his early years as French ambassador in Vienna, when he had failed to charm the Empress Maria Theresa and had earned, by that single long failure, the lifelong contempt of her daughter. "You may hope." 11 words altogether. Then she was gone, drawn back into the shrubbery by another shape he did not see clearly. A thin woman in dove gray, whose name was Jeanne de la Motte, and whom the cardinal believed to be the queen's confidant. Louis-René Edouard de Rohan, Grand Aumônier of France, Cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, stood up in the wet grass of Versailles on the night of the 11th of August, 1784, and believed that he had been forgiven. He had been waiting for that forgiveness for 14 years. Within 6 months he would sign, in his own hand, for a diamond necklace of 647 stones, on behalf of a queen who had not asked for it, and would never receive it. Within a year, he would be arrested in Cardinal's Red in the Galerie des Glaces of Versailles, on the Feast of the Assumption, in front of the entire court of France. 3 years before that night in the Bosquet, the cardinal had been at Saverne. Saverne was his other life, the life Versailles had refused him. The Prince Bishop of Strasbourg lived there in a palace that he had himself rebuilt, a vast, pink sandstone affair set on the Alsatian plain like a small Versailles transplanted into the Rhineland. He kept 14 footmen in livery, a stable of 40 horses, an aviary, a fish pond, a private orchestra, and the largest table service of silver gilt outside Paris. He spent, in the summer of 1781, almost 1,000,000 livres on his household alone. He did this because Versailles had told him he was forbidden the only place that mattered to him, and a man punished for ostentation will rarely respond by becoming modest. The cardinal kept morning audiences in a small green cabinet overlooking the south parterre. He saw petitioners by appointment, 2 each morning between 10 and noon, and his secretary was a thin Alsatian abbé named Georgel, who had been with him since the embassy years, and who held in his head every grudge, every alliance, every unpaid debt of the Rohan house. It was Georgel who, on a morning in late June 1781, set on the cardinal's writing table a folded paper sealed in green wax. "A widow," he said, "of the house of Valois." The cardinal looked up. He had, in 20 years of audiences, heard a great many claims to royal blood, most of them resolved on examination into the bye-blow of a country curate. He had learned not to react. The blood? From Henri II, by Nicole de Savigny. The line is documented. I have caused the genealogist of the Order of Malta to look at the papers. They are unusual, but they are not, in my estimation, forged. What does she want? What they all want. A pension. The cardinal turned the paper between his fingers. The wax was poor. The cipher was unfamiliar. He broke it. The hand was thin, slanted, decisive. The signature read, Jeanne de Valois, Comtesse de la Motte. There was a paragraph about her father, Baron Jacques de Saint-Remy, dying in the public ward of the Hôtel Dieu at the age of 48. There were 2 paragraphs about a pension of 800 livres a year granted to her at 15 by the late King Louis XV, and reduced by a clerk in the household to 700. There was a paragraph about a husband, Nicolas, who was a cavalry officer of the Burgundy regiment and not, by her honest admission, a man of fortune. There was no flattery anywhere in the letter, which interested the cardinal more than flattery would have done. "Bring her up," he said. She had been sitting in the antechamber for 2 hours. She came in without curtsying low, which interested him further. She was 25 that summer, small, thin, brown-eyed, with a long mouth that turned down slightly at the corners. Her gown was dove gray and had been turned twice at the cuffs. He noticed the cuffs before he noticed the face. A woman who had turned a gown twice was a woman who had been thinking about money for a long time. "Madame de la Motte, Your Eminence." "My secretary tells me you are a Valois." "My secretary, Your Eminence, would tell you the same. He smiled before he knew he was going to. He gestured to the small upright chair across the writing table. She sat down on its edge. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to write to the Cardinal de Bernice," she said. "He sits on the commission that confirms royal pensions. I have been refused twice. Your name would not be refused. I am asking for the pension to be restored to its original 800. I am not asking for it to be raised. Your husband has no charge? My husband is a captain. There has been no opportunity to purchase a charge. And you live in Paris, in a single room on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles. The landlord is a wig maker. I owe him for last quarter." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. "Why have you come to me?" She did not hesitate. "Because you have a reason to be useful to a Valois that no other cardinal in France has." "Which is?" "You have been disgraced at Versailles. The Queen does not receive you. The Empress wrote about you in a letter you will never see. If you restore a Valois to her ancient pension, the Queen of France may, in time, hear of it. She may, in time, think of you differently. I do not promise this. I observe that this is currently the only road you have." The cardinal sat very still. He was 50 that summer. He had been Grand Aumônier of France since the age of 34. He had spent his Vienna years as ambassador in a long, slow loss of the Empress's confidence, and had committed the single great error of his career when he allowed Maria Theresa to discover that he had spoken disrespectfully of her in a dispatch she should never have seen. The Empress had written to her daughter in Versailles, in one of the letters that traveled monthly between Vienna and Versailles in those years, that the Prince Louis de Rohan was the most untrustworthy man she had ever received an audience. Marie Antoinette, still in the first years of her marriage at Versailles, had read the letter, learned its sentences by heart in the way only an obedient daughter does, and had carried them with her for the rest of her life. 14 years later, the cardinal could not be in a room with the Queen of France without the air sharpening to a degree that everyone present felt. He had been required to surrender his place in the king's chapel. He came to Versailles for the great feasts and stood at the back of the gallery, and the Queen looked through him as though he were a column of dead air. The thin-faced woman in the chair across the table had said the thing aloud that he had not allowed himself to say in 2 years. And in exchange, I would be useful to you in turn. I have begun to be received at court. I have a means of approach to one of the Queen's ladies. I do not propose anything dishonorable. I propose only that, where information may travel in one direction now, it might in time travel in two. He could have ended the conversation there. He did not. I will write to Bernice, he said. I will write today. I will recommend you to him personally. Send me, in addition, a memoir of 3 pages establishing your descent. I will have Georgial examine it, and we will arrange for a small sum, while we wait for the pension, to be paid to you from the alms of this house. 500 livres at present, quarterly. She closed her eyes for a moment. He saw the small movement of her throat as she swallowed. Your Eminence is very generous. My Eminence is very tired, he said, and, I confess, very curious. She inclined her head and rose. At the door she turned. I do not know yet how I will be useful to you, Your Eminence. I will know within the year. Take your time, the cardinal said, with that smile he had learned in his Vienna years, which had charmed everyone but the Empress. I have been waiting 14 years already. A few more months will not break me. He thought, as the door closed, that he had spoken the truth. He had not. He had waited 14 years among many men. He could not wait among one woman. Not at Saverne, with its silver gilt and its 40 horses and its imitation Versailles. Not in the Green Cabinet, with its unread dispatches and its untouched fish pond. He needed by then to be forgiven by the Queen of France in the way other men need air. Madame de la Motte had walked in carrying that need on a paper for him to break open. He had broken it open. That evening, his nephew, the Prince de Guimené, came down from Strasbourg to dine. The cardinal had had the chef prepare partridge in a sauce of figs that Georgel particularly disliked. The dining room at Saverne was a long gallery with 30 windows and a coffered ceiling painted by an Italian named Bigari. 8 footmen served 3 diners. The cardinal observed the absurdity of it, as he observed most things, with an irony that did not stop him from continuing. "Your guest this morning," the prince said, dipping his fingers in the rose-water bowl. "The small woman in gray. Who was she?" "Of Valois, by documentation. By the female line, presumably. By the female line. And the petition? A pension. Restoration of 800 livres, reduced by a clerk who is no doubt now dead. You will write?" "I have written." The prince was 8 years younger than the cardinal and considered himself the more intelligent of the two. He had read the cardinal's situation, in private, the way one reads the chart of a long illness. He thought his uncle was foolish about Marie Antoinette. He thought his uncle was foolish about Cagliostro, who had been spending the summer at Saverne in a private apartment on the second floor, with 2 retorts, an Athenor, and an Egyptian boy. He thought his uncle was foolish about most things since 1774, when the new queen had refused to receive him. "Uncle," he said carefully, "the little Valois. Did she speak to you about the queen?" The cardinal lifted his glass and looked at the color of the wine. "She did, and she offered nothing. She observed something, which was that I might find her useful, in an indirect way, in time." The prince set down his own glass. "Be careful with her." "I have been at court for 30 years, the cardinal said pleasantly. "I am by now careful with everyone." "Then be more careful with her than with the others. She came up to me in the courtyard before she came up to you. She had calculated to the half hour the moment Georgel would set her petition on your table. She asked me what mood you would be in. She asked it the way a woman asks the price of fish. And what did you tell her? That you would receive her, that she should sit on the edge of the chair, that she should not flatter, that she should not call you the most generous prelate in France, that, if she said the word Vienna in any sentence, you would dismiss her." The cardinal laughed. He laughed loud enough that the senior footman, who was pouring the wine of Hermitage at the sideboard, paused for an instant out of training. "You told her, in short, exactly how to get what she wanted." "I told her, uncle, what she had already worked out. I told her only the half I thought she had not." "And why?" The prince looked at him directly across the long table. "Because the man Cagliostro upstairs spoke to me last night about the queen. Because the small Valois woman in the courtyard spoke to me this morning about you. Because 2 people in 2 days in this house are calculating the geometry of your forgiveness. I am uneasy." "Of what?" "Of you, uncle. I have known you all my life. You are a vain man and a generous one. The two together are the most dangerous combination at this court. You will lend the Valois woman more than money. You will lend her, eventually, your name. And I am afraid that when you do, you will not have read the cost of the lending." The cardinal smiled at him with great fondness. "My dear boy," he said, "you have your grandfather's face and his caution. He died in 1767 without being forgiven by Louis XV. I do not propose to die without being forgiven by Marie Antoinette. If the road to that forgiveness passes through a small woman in gray on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles, I am willing to walk it. Even if she is, as you suggest, dangerous. Even if she is, as Georgel suggests, half fraudulent. The queen has stopped looking at me. I will accept any road that ends with her looking at me again." The prince did not answer. He held his glass between his hands. The footman moved behind him and refilled it, and the Italian ceiling went on showing chariots and clouds and gods turning their heads. That night, in the small library off the green cabinet, the cardinal wrote 3 letters. The first was to the Cardinal de Bernis in Rome, recommending Madame de la Motte to the commission that confirmed royal pensions. The second was to the Abbé Georgel, instructing him to pay out from the alms 500 livres on the morning of the first of each new quarter, and to take a receipt. The third was to himself. He did not seal it. He put it in the back of the cabinet under the dispatches of 1773, and he did not look at it again for 4 years. It read, "I have today resolved that I will be reconciled with the Queen of France. I have today engaged, towards that end, a small instrument of the female line of the Valois. I have today set aside the warning of my nephew, who is wiser than I am. May God forgive me if I have erred. L.E.R." He had erred. He had not yet erred fatally. That came later. The wigmaker on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles came up the stairs at 6:30 on the morning of the 4th of October, 1783, and pounded on the door with the flat of his hand. Jeanne de Lamotte was already dressed. She had been dressed since 5. She had been awake longer than that. "Madame, Monsieur Sandrach, the quarter, you will have it by Thursday. You said Thursday last week." "I said it last week, and I am saying it this week, and the answer is the same. Thursday." The wigmaker was a small Alsatian, with a face the color of cooked veal. He had let 2 rooms on his upper floor to the Comtesse de Lamotte for 3 years, and for 3 years she had paid him on Thursdays. Sometimes in winter, on the 2nd Thursday of the month, he was not a brutal man. He was the father of 4 daughters. He was, however, a man with his own ledger, and the ledger was a brown, calf-bound book that lived on the counter of his shop downstairs, and the ledger had begun to be unkind. "Madam, the husband? Captain de Lamotte is at exercise in Bar-sur-Aube. He returns on Wednesday." "And he brings?" "His full salary." "Madam, he brought last quarter 96 livres. This quarter he brings 212. "Truly?" "Monsieur Sandrar, I am the daughter of Jacques de Saint-Remy, Baron of Essoyer, descendant of King Henri II. I am not in the habit of lying about money to my wigmaker." The wigmaker took a small breath through his nose and let it out slowly. "Madam," he said, "Thursday." He went back down the stairs. Jeanne closed the door, turned the key, walked the length of the single room to the small writing table at the window, sat down, and put her face into her hands for the space of 1 slow count of 30. Then she lifted her face, opened the small ledger in front of her, and began to write. The ledger had 2 columns. The left column was titled in her own hand, "Real." The right column was titled, "Promised." The left column ran to 1,670 livres, of which 800 was the pension restored by the intervention of the Cardinal in 1781, and now paid quarterly at the Hôtel des Invalides, and 500 was the alms paid quarterly by the Cardinal's household at Saverne, and the remaining 370 was the captain's salary as a cavalry officer of no fortune. The right column ran to 4,200 livres, of which the largest figure, 1,200, was a loan from a Genoese named Caruti, who had a shop on the Quai des Orfèvres, and the patience of a man who had heard her cite the Valois name 3 times. The second largest, 800, was a debt to the man Rétaux de Villette, who was not a creditor in any honest sense, and whom she did not allow herself to think of as a creditor at all. She set the ledger aside. She drew towards her a second book, smaller, bound in green morocco, that contained no figures at all. It contained, in her own hand, fragments of letters. They were copies. They were copies, more precisely, of letters that had not yet been written. She had begun the Green Book in 1782, during a winter so cold that the Seine had frozen and the woodsellers had quadrupled their prices. She had begun it for the simple reason that the cardinal had to be given something, and the something had to look like the queen, and she did not herself know how the queen sounded on paper. She had collected that winter 3 samples of authentic royal hand, 2 from a footman in the queen's household whom Rétaux had bought with a Spanish gold piece, and 1 from a glovemaker on Rue Saint-Honoré who had been paid for a pair of gloves with a personal note. From these 3 samples she had made, with Rétaux's coaching, 20 practice pages. She had then turned the practice pages over to Rétaux himself, who had a steady hand and a soft conscience, and Rétaux had, by the spring of 1783, become someone who could write, on demand, in the hand of Marie Antoinette of Austria, Queen of France and Navarre. There remained the question of the signature. Jeanne had spent 2 full evenings on the signature. The Queen, she had been informed by the footman, signed in private letters either Marie Antoinette, 2 words, or, more rarely and with intimates, simply Antoinette. She had never in any sample added the formula de France. That formula belonged to royal birth, to children born of the king and queen, not to a foreign-born consort. Jeanne knew this. Rétaux knew this. They had discussed it in October 1782 over a small dinner of mutton at the Cadran Bleu, and had decided, against the evidence and for reasons of theater, that they would sign anyway, Marie Antoinette de France. 3 words. The third word, they had agreed, would be the thing that made the cardinal kneel. A man who is not deceived by it does not deserve to be deceived, Rétaux had said. A man who is deceived by it deserves whatever follows. Jean had looked at him across the small table and had not entirely disagreed. She turned now, in the green book, to the page she had been working on the previous evening. It was a draft of a letter to be sent to the cardinal on the 15th of October, 11 days hence, in which the queen, who had never written him a line in her life, would invite him to consider himself, finally, restored to her private good opinion. Jean read what she had written. She crossed out 2 phrases. She wrote in a third. She set down the pen. There was a knock at the door. It was Rétaux himself. He had let himself in with his own key. How much? Sandrat was here. He wants the quarter. How much for everything? 4,200. And how much in? 1670. He sat down at the foot of the bed. He was 32 that autumn, a thin man with a narrow mouth and pale lashes, who had been a notary's clerk in the Rue Vieille du Temple before he had met Jean in the salon of the Comtesse de Boulainvilliers, who collected impoverished Valois women and impoverished young men of letters in equal proportion. He had been Jean's lover for 2 years. He understood on most subjects exactly what she was thinking. You have written the letter. I have written a draft. Read it to me. She read it. He listened. At the end he said, cut the line about the king's brother. He will frighten. He will not move. He will move, she said. He is 50 years old. He has been frightened since 74. He will move only if the letter is just slightly too daring. If the letter is what he expects, he will fold it and put it in his pocket and write back a polite acknowledgement that I am to deliver. If the letter is 2 degrees beyond what he expects, he will write back a long letter that I am to deliver back. And then? Then the queen will answer. And then he will answer. And then the queen will answer again. And then we will be in the middle of a correspondence that will last 6 months and that will, by Easter, have produced enough paper for the cardinal to believe that he has been forgiven. 6 months is a long time, Jean. 6 months of 40,000 cards. Then you must find me a way, she said, to make 6 months profitable, while we wait for the man to walk forward. Rétaux looked at her. He had been waiting for the question. He had brought in his coat pocket an answer. There is a young woman, he said, whom I saw 3 weeks ago in the Palais Royal. Jean looked up. She let him continue. She works as a milliner in a shop in the arcades of the Palais Royal. She is not what she pretends to be at the shop. She is, in the evenings, available. She is 22, perhaps 23. She is taller than you, not by much. Her hair is the color of yours, but lighter. Her eyes are blue. Her chin is narrow. Her mouth is small. She is in profile in the dusk, in muslin, almost exactly the Queen of France. There was a long pause. She looks like Antoinette. From 10 paces in moonlight, in a white gall, yes. From 3 paces in daylight, no. But the cardinal will not be 3 paces from her. The cardinal will be 8 paces from her in the dark, and he will be on his knees, and he will be expecting her. Jean set the green book down. And what does she think she is? She thinks she is a girl from Rue du Jour, who came to Paris from a village in Picardy 3 years ago, who has had 2 protectors and currently has none, and who was paid 4 louis last week for a single evening at the Café de Foix. What is her name? Marie Nicole Leguay. She calls herself in the shop Mademoiselle d'Oliva. Bring her. When? Whenever you can make her come. Tomorrow. She does not know what she is being brought for. Tell her there is a small task, that the pay is 15,000 livres, that the task requires only that she play, for a quarter of an hour at most, a part she has not been told the name of, in a place she will not be told the name of, in front of a man she will never see again. 15,000, yes. We do not have it. We will have it, by the spring of '84, 20 times over. I am not going to bargain on the price of the only piece of the geometry I cannot replace. Rétaux nodded slowly. Tomorrow, then, at noon. Mademoiselle d'Oliva came at noon on the 5th of October, 1783. She came on foot. She came in a brown silk gown that was not new. She came accompanied by Rétaux, who waited downstairs in the wigmaker's shop and conversed politely with Sandrart about the price of horsehair. Jean received her in the room with the writing table at the window. She had set out 2 cups of coffee. She had asked Sandrart's wife for an almond biscuit. She had placed on the corner of the table a small folded paper bearing 5 gold coins. She had calculated that the gold coins should be visible, but not commented upon, for the first 10 minutes. Mademoiselle Leguet, Madame la Comtesse, sit, please. Take the coffee. The biscuit is from the bakery on Rue de Sévigné. It is the best biscuit in Paris. The girl sat. She took the coffee in both hands. She did not look at the gold coins. She was, Jean saw at once, more than Rétaux had said and less. More because she was, in fact, in profile. And in the half-light from the window, startlingly, the queen. The same long throat, the same narrow upper lip, the same slightly receding chin that everyone at court had learned by long practice not to look at. Less because she was, in person, a frightened girl of 22 who held her coffee in both hands as a child holds a hot cup. I have been told, the girl said, that there is a task. There is a task. I have been told that the pay is very large. It is. What is the task? Jean leaned forward. Mademoiselle, I will not lie to you. I will not tell you today the whole of what the task is. I will tell you today what I know you can do. You are very pretty. You have a particular face. You have a face that, in the dark, in a certain gown, with a certain veil, resembles a very high lady at the court of Versailles. There is a gentleman who has, for many years, wished to make his peace with that lady. The lady, for reasons of her own, cannot meet him. She has asked me as a favor to find a way for the gentleman to believe he has been received. Briefly, in a garden, at night, for not more than a quarter of an hour. The gentleman is a man of the church. The garden is at Versailles. The gentleman will kneel. The gentleman will kiss the hem of your gown. You will press a rose into his hand. You will whisper 11 words that I will write down for you in advance and that you will learn by tomorrow morning. You will then be drawn back into the shrubbery by me, and the matter will be ended. You will be paid in livres, 15,000. The girl did not speak for a long moment. 11 words, I will write them on paper. You will memorize them. You will not deviate. And the gentleman will believe that he has spoken with the lady. And the lady will hear of it the following morning and will be pleased. And no one is hurt. No one is hurt. And it is 15,000 livres. It is. I do not have it on the table this morning. I have on the table this morning 5 louis as earnest of my good faith. The remainder will be paid in 2 parts, half on the morning before the meeting, half on the morning after. The girl looked at the gold coins. She looked at the window. She looked at Jean's face. Madam, I am, as you know, not a woman of consequence. I am not, however, a woman who likes mysteries. I would prefer to know more. I cannot tell you more today. I will tell you more as we go. I will tell you, in any case, before the night itself, everything that you need to know to perform the task safely. Nothing in what I'm asking you to do is a crime. Nothing in what I'm asking you to do is contrary to the honor of the lady. I am, as my husband and I both are, a member of the court party. I am known at Versailles. I am, by descent, of Valois. I would not propose to a girl of your age and your situation any task that I would not propose to my own younger sister, if I had one. The girl drank the rest of her coffee. She set the cup down on its saucer. She picked up one of the gold coins, examined it briefly, and put it back where it had been. Madam, I will come back tomorrow. I will give you my answer. That is fair. What time? At any time of the morning. I will be here. The girl stood. She inclined her head. She left. Jean sat at the writing table for half an hour after she had gone. She did not write. She did not move. She thought, for a long time, about something Rétaux had once said to her, in a different room, at a different table, about the difference between a person who is deceived and a person who is consumed. The girl was about to be consumed. The girl did not know it. The girl would, in fact, never know it. Because in 18 months, when the affair had broken open and the Parlement of Paris was demanding names, the girl would be in the Bastille, with a child in her belly, having understood by then exactly what she had agreed to, but having understood it 18 months too late. She thought all this and put it aside. She returned to the green book. She wrote 2 paragraphs more. In the courtyard below, Rétaux paid Sandrart 80 livres on account, took a receipt in his own name, and walked away whistling. That same afternoon, in his Paris house on the Rue Vieille du Temple, Cardinal de Rohan had been sitting for 2 hours with a letter open on his knee. The letter had arrived by hand. It bore no superscription. The wax was plain. The hand was familiar by now. It was the 3rd such letter in 8 weeks. It read in part, "The lady has been informed of the new attitude of your eminence in the matter of the Polignac household. The lady has, in private, expressed herself favorably. The lady wishes me to convey that, while she cannot yet receive your eminence in audience, she has begun to consider the question of audience with a degree of openness that she had not previously possessed. Marie Antoinette de France." The cardinal had read the letter the first time at noon and had set it down. He had read it the second time at 3 and had set it down. He was at 5 reading it for the 4th time. Each reading produced in him the same combined sensation of lightheadedness and gravity, as though he had been told that his estate had doubled and that simultaneously an old wound had reopened. His secretary, the Abbé Georgel, came in at 5:30 with the day's correspondence. "Eminence, Georgel, you are reading the new one. I am reading the new one. Will you answer?" "I will answer. Today, today." Georgel set down the day's pile and lifted from it the topmost folded paper. "From Saverne, the pension list for the new year. 460 livres requested for a new chaplain in the chapel at Strasbourg. The annual contribution to the orphanage of the Rue de Sèvres, 1,200. The quarterly 500 for Madame de la Motte." The cardinal raised his eyes from the letter on his knee. He looked for a long second at Georgel's narrow Alsatian face. "Continue the quarterly. Increase it to 750. Eminence. 750. Quarterly. Eminence. Forgive me. May I ask what merits the increase?" The cardinal folded the letter on his knee and slid it into the breast of his cassock. "She has been," he said, "more useful to me than I expected." Georgel did not respond. He had been the cardinal's secretary for 16 years. He had learned, in the first 3 of them, that there were sentences his master spoke after which silence was the only possible reply. He inclined his head, took up the pension list, and left the room. The cardinal sat alone for a long time. The afternoon light failed in the tall window. The candles were brought. The footman withdrew. The cardinal took out the letter again and, by the light of the candles, read it for the 5th time. He believed it. He had begun, in fact, to believe it by then, in the way a sick man begins to believe in a cure. He had stopped, by the autumn of 1783, asking himself whether the letters were what they appeared to be. He had stopped because to continue asking would have required him to face the possibility that the Queen of France had still not forgiven him, and that the small, gray-eyed Valois woman at the wigmaker's house on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles had been all along building a paper bridge to nowhere. He could not face that possibility. He was 52. He had been Grand Aumônier for 18 years. He had been disgraced for 9. He picked up his own pen and he began to write back. By the spring of 1784, the correspondence had reached the 12th letter. By the summer, the cardinal was paying a courier 200 livres a month to ride between Paris and Versailles, carrying nothing but folded papers in plain wax. By the end of July, Jeanne de la Motte had, in her green book, a list of 12 replies in the cardinal's own hand, each of them beginning with the formula, "Madame, the most august person in the world," and each of them ending with the words, "the humblest and the most grateful of your subjects." On the 3rd of August, 1784, she sent him the 13th letter. It did not refer to the previous 12, it referred only to a small request. It asked the cardinal whether, on a night to be specified, he could arrange to be alone in a particular grove at Versailles, after the king and queen had retired, in order to receive a brief and silent acknowledgement. The cardinal read this letter once. He answered within the hour. He answered, yes. The girl was crying. She had been crying since they had left the inn at Versailles village, where Jean had laced her into the white muslin gall and had pinned the little straw hat with the long ribbon. She was not crying loudly. She was crying in the way a horse trembles when it has been driven too hard, an involuntary movement of the throat that she could not stop, and that Jean, walking ahead of her on the gravel path under the stars, refused to acknowledge. It was 20 minutes before midnight on the 11th of August, 1784. They had come through the lower gate. They had bribed a single undergardener with 12 livres. They had walked through the long avenue of clipped charmilles, past the dark mass of the orangerie, past the silent basin of Apollo, into the wooded heart of the Bosquets. The moon was 3 days off full. There were no clouds. Versailles slept the way a great animal sleeps, all around them in its many courts and apartments and stables. The queen, at that hour, was at the Petit Trianon, 2 miles distant, asleep in her own gilt and blue bed, the small son she had borne 3 summers earlier in the care of his governess in a separate pavilion, and Madame de Polignac at hand within the household. She did not know. She would never know. She would learn in 18 months that she had been impersonated, by night, in a particular bosquet of her own garden, by a milliner from Rue de Jour, in order to deceive a cardinal she had not spoken to in 14 years. And she would say only, to Madame Campan, her first woman of the bedchamber, on the carriage road back from the Trianon that morning, "It is not even my fault. It is not even something I have done. They have done it to me anyway." But that conversation was 18 months away. On the night itself, she slept. The girl whispered behind Jean, "Madame, I cannot." "You can. Madame," quietly. "He is very near." He was. The cardinal had been waiting in the Bosquet de Venus since 11. He had come in his own carriage to the south gate, had dismissed the carriage with instructions to return at 1, and had walked in alone. He wore a long, dark cloak over a plain coat. He had not worn the cardinal's red. He had not worn the cross of the Holy Spirit. He had worn in a small velvet bag in his inside pocket a single object, a small enamel miniature of himself at the age of 30, ordered by the Queen of France, his enemy, 12 years before he had become her enemy. He intended to leave it on the path where she would tread. He had not been in the Bosquet at night for 15 years. He had walked there in the spring of 1769 with his mother, who had brought him to Versailles to make sure he understood that his career, then beginning, was not a private matter, but a thing that belonged to his family. He remembered the smell of the box hedges, and the particular crunch of the gravel, and the sound of the basins beyond the trees, and the patches of light that the lanterns of the chateau threw into the wood when the king was awake. He stood now, at 52, in the same wood, the lanterns of the chateau low and reduced because the king slept, and he understood that he was about to be permitted to repair, in a single quarter of an hour, the geometry of his entire life. He heard the gravel. He did not turn. He had been instructed in the 13th letter not to turn. He went down on one knee on the wet grass between 2 box-shaped yews. He bowed his head. He closed his eyes. He waited. The girl was a step behind Jean. Jean stopped at the edge of the clearing, gave the girl the rose, and stepped sideways into the shadow of a hedge. The girl walked forward. She walked the way she had been taught to walk that afternoon, slowly, with her shoulders back, with her chin lifted, with her right hand at her waist holding the rose. She did not look down at the cardinal. She had been told not to look down. She had been told to stop 2 paces from him, to extend her hand, to allow him to kiss it, to press the rose into the kissed hand, and then to retreat backwards into the hedge, while Jean, from the shadow, would say one word, which would be the girl's signal to turn and go. She stopped 2 paces from him. She extended her hand. He did not look up. He took her gloved fingers in both of his hands. He bent his face to them. He kissed the knuckles of the glove. He held her hand against his forehead. He stayed there longer than she had been told he would. She felt his forehead trembling against the back of her hand. He was crying. The Cardinal of France was crying, with his face against the glove of a milliner from Rue de Jour, in the Bosquet de Venus of his king's garden, at 23 minutes before midnight on the 11th of August, 1784. The girl forgot the 11 words. For a long second, she could not, by any effort, remember them. She knew that she was meant to whisper. She knew that she was meant to whisper a particular thing. She could not retrieve from her own throat the thing she was meant to whisper. She felt the cardinal's tears on the back of her glove. She felt the wet grass through the soles of her satin shoes. She felt, somewhere at the edge of her hearing, Jean's breath sharpening in the shadow. Then the words came back. "You may hope," she whispered. Her voice was lower than her own voice. She had practiced. She had practiced with Jean that afternoon in the inn 14 times. She had got the voice almost right. She got it right then. The cardinal raised his face slightly. He did not raise it enough to see hers. He could not, in any case, have seen her face. The straw hat shaded her, and the ribbon shaded her, and the night shaded her, and the moon was on the far side of the bosquet. She put the rose into his hand. She withdrew her own hand. She stepped backwards once, twice. From the shadow, Jean's voice said in a tone of polite command, "Madame, someone comes." There was no one coming. It was the agreed word. The girl turned. She walked back into the hedge. Jean took her arm. Together they walked, not quickly, not slowly, out of the bosquet, along the gravel, past the basin of Apollo, past the dark orangery, past the lower gate. They reached the carriage at 1 minute past midnight. Rétaux was waiting in it. The girl sat down on the seat opposite him and put her face into both of her hands. "It went well," Jean said. "It went well," Rétaux said. The carriage moved. The cardinal stayed in the bosquet alone for 8 more minutes. He sat down finally on the wet grass, with the rose still in his hand. He smelled it. He put it inside his coat. He took out the small velvet bag with the enamel miniature, opened it, looked at the painted face of himself at 30, and laid the miniature on the grass where she had been standing. It would be found 2 mornings later by a gardener, and would be returned to the cardinal's household at Strasbourg by a confidential route arranged by the Abbé Georgel, who would never ask, in writing or in speech, how it had come to be in the Bosquet de Vénus. The cardinal walked back to his carriage at 5 minutes past 1. He drove to Paris. He arrived at the Rue Vieille du Temple at 5:30 in the morning. He went directly to his chapel and prayed for an hour, kneeling, for the soul of the Empress Maria Theresa, who had died 4 years before, and whom he had finally, on the night of the 11th of August, in the Bosquet de Vénus, defeated. He believed he had defeated her. He was wrong about that and about everything else. Through the autumn and into the new year, the correspondence between the cardinal and the supposed queen continued. 21 further letters in his own hand, by Jean's later count, each carried by the same paid courier between Paris and Versailles, each replied to within a day. In late January 1785, Jean wrote to him on stationery she had had made up specially in Paris, with a small embossed crown that she had copied, imperfectly, from the corner of a fan. The letter said that the lady had heard of a particular jewel currently being offered by the court jewelers, and that the lady wished to acquire it, but that the lady, for reasons of household economy, could not be seen to acquire it directly, and that the lady wondered whether His Eminence might be willing, as a private act of friendship, to negotiate the purchase on her behalf, against a written promise of repayment in installments. The jewel was a necklace. Its valuation was 1,600,000 livres. The cardinal read the letter twice. He had become accustomed by then to reading these letters twice. He sent for the Abbé Georgel and asked him to make discreet enquiries about the court jewelers, the firm Baumer and Bassange of the Quai des Orfèvres. Georgel returned the following afternoon with the necklace. It was the largest single piece of jewelry in France. It contained 647 stones. It contained 2,800 carats. It had been commissioned originally in 1772 by Louis XV as a gift for Madame du Barry. The king had died in 1774, before the commission was complete. The jewelers had then offered it 3 separate times to the new queen, Marie Antoinette, who had 3 separate times refused it, on the explicit grounds that the kingdom needed warships more than the queen needed diamonds. The jewelers had then sought for 10 years a buyer somewhere in Europe, a Russian, an Englishman, a Spaniard. They had found none. The necklace, by January 1785, was a burden the firm of Baumer and Bassange could no longer carry. They were prepared, when Georgel knocked on their door, to entertain almost any proposition that did not break their oath of professional discretion. The cardinal sat with the necklace on a velvet cloth on his writing table for an hour. He looked at it. He did not touch it. He thought, very precisely, that he was looking at his own forgiveness, made physical, weighing perhaps 4 pounds, refracting the candlelight into 100 small rainbows along the marquetry of the table. He thought of the warships the Queen had said the kingdom needed instead. He thought of the document of credit he was about to sign. He thought of the 4 payments, of 400,000 livres each, that the document would oblige him personally to settle in the event the Queen's repayment failed. He thought that this was, finally, no longer a paper bridge. This was a steel bridge. The Queen, when she received this object and wore it and was seen in it, would owe him not gratitude in the abstract, but a specific debt of 1,600,000 livres, the geometry of which would bind her to him for the rest of his life and hers. He signed. He signed the receipt at 4 in the afternoon of the 1st of February, 1785. He signed beside the signatures of Baumer and Bassange. He countersigned on the lower corner what the document called the Queen's consent, which was a single line he had been authorized by the 13th letter to add in his own hand, and which read in his own ink, Approuvé, Marie Antoinette de France. He had been writing the formula, Marie Antoinette de France, in his own hand, at the bottom of his replies, for 16 months. He no longer noticed it was wrong. The necklace went to Jeanne that night. She received it in the room on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles. She locked the door. She drew the curtains. She set the velvet case on the dressing table and opened it. Rétaux stood beside her. They did not speak for a long minute. Tools, Jeanne said. He had brought them. A jeweler's loop, a small flat chisel of soft brass, a pair of fine pincers, a pair of cotton gloves, a roll of green baize, a second roll of gray linen for the cleaning of the stones. He laid them on the table beside the case. How long? 3 nights. We work only after midnight. We rest the eyes every hour. The stones come out by the setting. We separate the small, we keep the large for last. The large where? London. Jeanne nodded. She picked up the necklace. It was heavier than she had imagined. She had imagined it lighter, because she had imagined it as the abstract instrument of her freedom. But the abstract instrument of her freedom weighed, in fact, 4 pounds, and she could feel in her fingers the gold of the setting, the small claws of the prongs, the cold of the stones. She set it down on the green baize. She picked up the chisel. She began. By the morning of the 4th of February, the necklace had ceased to exist. 647 stones lay in 7 small leather pouches in the chest under the bed. The gold of the setting, broken into 18 pieces, lay in a single linen wrap in the dressing table drawer. By the 8th of February, Nicolas de la Motte was on the night coach to London, with 3 of the 7 pouches and a forged letter of introduction to a fence in Soho. By the end of March, 312 stones had been sold in London at an average of 2/3 of their valuation. By April, Jean had paid Sandrat the wigmaker 8 quarters of back rent in a single transaction, and had moved to a new lodging in a townhouse on the Rue Saint-Gilles proper, with 2 servants and a carriage. And by the morning of the 15th of August, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, the great state occasion at Versailles, when the King and Queen received the corps diplomatique and the cardinals processed in their red, the matter broke open. The firm of Baumer and Bassange had been writing to the Queen since June, addressing her in the polite paraphrase the etiquette of Versailles required when a debt was being mentioned. The Queen, who knew nothing of the debt, had been throwing the letters into the fire. By the 11th of August, Baumer had grown desperate. On the 12th, he had presented himself at the Queen's morning toilette and had spoken to Madame Campan, the Queen's first woman of the bedchamber, plainly. By the 14th, Madame Campan had spoken to the Queen. By the morning of the 15th, the Queen had spoken to the King. The King was at his armoire when the Cardinal entered the Galerie de Glace in scarlet. The procession had paused. The Cardinal was at the head of it. He was carrying the missal. He had come to attend the King to Mass. A footman touched his elbow. Eminence, His Majesty wishes a word in private, in the Cabinet du Conseil. The Cardinal turned. He saw, for a single second, the Queen across the hall, in white, with diamonds in her hair, looking at him. She did not look away. She did not, this time, look through him. She looked, for the first time in 15 years, directly at him. and what was in her face was neither anger, nor coldness, nor recognition. It was, he understood afterwards, the bright, dilated attention of a person who was about to watch another person fall a great distance. He went with the footman. In the cabinet du Conseil, the king was standing. The keeper of the seals was beside him. The minister of the king's household was at the writing table with a paper. The cardinal bowed. "Sire, Eminence, we have a question for you. We will ask it once. You will answer truly." "Always, sire." "Did you, on the 1st of February of this year, sign a receipt for a necklace of diamonds on behalf of the Queen with the firm Baumer and Bassange for 1,600,000 livres?" The cardinal looked at the king. He looked at the keeper of the seals. He looked finally at the minister at the writing table. He understood in the space of a single intake of breath that the necklace had not reached the Queen. He understood that the letters had not come from the Queen. He understood that he had been kneeling in the Bosquet de Venus on the 11th of August, 1784, to a person who had not been the Queen. He understood that he had been writing, in his own hand, the formula Marie Antoinette de France, in 12 replies and 1 signed receipt for 16 months, to a woman in dove gray on Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles, whose name had been mentioned to him by his nephew 3 years before, with a warning he had laughed off across a long table at Saverne, under a ceiling painted by Bigary. He understood that he was about to be arrested in the Cardinal's Red, on the Feast of the Assumption, in the Galerie des Glaces of Versailles, in front of the entire court of France. "Sire," he said, "I have been deceived." "That," the king said quietly, "is also what we have come to understand. The question, Eminence, is, by whom?" The keeper of the seals stepped forward. He laid a hand on the cardinal's sleeve. "Eminence," he said, "you will come with us." They walked the cardinal back through the Galerie des Glaces, between the lines of courtiers, in his red robes, under his red beretta, past the candle chandeliers reflected to infinity in the 17 mirrored arcades, past the Queen, who did not look at him this time, past his own nephew, the Prince de Guémené, whose face was perfectly still, and out through the king's antechamber to a closed carriage waiting in the courtyard. The carriage drove him to the Bastille. He arrived there at 20 minutes past noon on the 15th of August, 1785. He was given the apartment of state, which was reserved for prisoners of the first rank. He was provided with his secretary, the Abbé Georgel, who had been arrested separately and brought to the same apartment within the hour. He was given pen, paper, and access to confessor. He sat down at the small writing table by the window. He wrote, in his own hand, a single line, which he gave the next morning to Georgel to convey to his nephew. It read, "I have been a fool. I do not yet know how completely." Within the week, Jeanne de la Motte had been arrested at her townhouse, found in the attic with 2 pouches of diamonds and a letter half burnt in the grate. Within the fortnight, Rétaux de Villette had been taken on the road to Geneva. Within the month, Mademoiselle d'Oliva had been found in a room above a tobacconist in the Rue Saint-Honoré, pregnant by a man whose name she would not give, and would be conveyed to the Bastille in a closed sedan chair, weeping, on the morning of the 5th of October, exactly 1 year to the day after she had drunk her coffee with 2 hands in front of the woman in the dove-gray gown. By Christmas, the Parlement of Paris had begun its proceedings. The Queen had stopped sleeping. The Cardinal had stopped writing. The little Valois woman had begun to plan her defense. The Parlement of Paris took 9 months and 17 days to read the affair. It read the affair in the Grande Chambre, a long, paneled room on the Ile de la Cité, where the magistrates sat in red-trimmed black, and where the air, by the spring of 1786, smelled of tallow and ink, and the cologne of 64 men who had been listening, for 9 months, to the slow disassembly of the small Versailles geometry of the previous year. The first president of the Parliament was a man named Daligre, who had outlived 4 king's ministers, and who, by his 68th year, had developed the particular patience required to hear the testimony of, in succession, a queen's first lady-in-waiting, a Genoese moneylender, 2 London diamond merchants brought across the Channel under safe conduct, an under-gardener of Versailles who had been bribed for 12 livres on the night of the 11th of August, a wig maker from Rue Neuve Saint-Gilles, who produced his calf-bound ledger and read aloud, in a small, precise voice, 16 quarterly entries of late rent. An innkeeper from Versailles village who had laced a girl into a white gall, and a milliner from Rue de Jour who, by the time of her testimony on the 17th of May, was 23 years old, had given birth in the Bastille 3 weeks earlier, and had not yet been permitted to see her son. Mademoiselle d'Oliva was the most watched witness of the trial. She came into the Grande Chambre on the 17th of May in a plain dark gown that the prison administration had bought for her out of a charity fund administered by the Comtesse de Genlis. She walked with her hands folded at her waist. She did not raise her eyes. She had been instructed by her advocate, the Maître Blondel, to answer only the questions asked and to add nothing. She answered, in the course of 2 hours, 83 questions. She answered them in the small voice of a girl who had understood at some point in the 8 months between her arrest and her testimony exactly what she had agreed to and exactly what it had cost her. She answered them without protesting her ignorance, although her ignorance had been almost total at the time. She answered them instead with the patience of a person who has been carrying a child in a prison cell and who has stopped trying to argue with the people who put her there. She said yes, she had pretended to be the queen, although she had not known it was the queen. She said yes, she had whispered the 11 words she had been taught. She said yes, she had taken the rose and given it to the gentleman, although she had not known he was the cardinal. She said yes, she had been paid 15,000 livres, of which she had received 4,000, and had spent 2,000, and had returned at her arrest 22 louis. She said no, she had not known the lady. She said no, she had not known the man. She said no, she had not understood at the time that what she was doing was a crime, although she said, when pressed, that she would have understood now. The cardinal sat in the front row of the spectators. He had been brought from the Bastille each morning for the 9 months of his confinement, and had been brought for the trial itself each day at 8:30 in a closed carriage with 2 officers of the Garde de Paris. He wore in the Grande Chambre the cardinal's red. He had insisted. The king had not forbidden it. He had grown in the Bastille perceptibly thinner. He had read in his apartment of state the entire vitae of the Cardinal d'Ossat, and had taken some comfort from the fact that the predecessor in the office of Grand Aumônier had 2 centuries earlier also been ridiculed in a great public matter. He looked at Mademoiselle d'Oliva for the full 2 hours of her testimony. He looked with particular concentration at her profile when she turned towards the bench. He saw then, with an absolute clarity that came too late to do him any good, that she did not resemble the queen at all. Not in the chin, which was rounder, not in the mouth, which was wider, not in the throat, not in the carriage of the shoulders. She resembled the queen, he understood, only at 8 paces, in the dark, in moonlight, in a white gall, when one was on one's knees with one's eyes closed. He had been on his knees. His eyes had been closed. When she left the Grande Chambre at the end of her testimony, she passed within 2 arms' length of him. She did not look at him. She did not, in fact, know he was there. She had been told to look at the floor, and she looked at the floor. The officers of the guard escorted her back into the corridor, and from the corridor to the closed sedan chair, and from the sedan chair to her cell at the Bastille, where her son was waiting in the arms of a wet nurse provided also out of a charity fund by the Comtesse de Genlis. The verdict of the Parlement was read in the Grande Chambre on the 31st of May, 1786, at 10:05 in the morning. The Cardinal de Rohan was acquitted. The Parlement found that he had been deceived. It restored him to all his offices and dignities. The king, 2 days later, removed him from those offices and dignities by personal letter, and ordered him to retire to the Abbey of Chaise-Dieu in the Auvergne, 640 kilometers south of Versailles. The cardinal acknowledged the order in a single line of his own hand, returned the seal of the Grand Almonership to the Garde des Sceaux, and left Paris in a plain carriage with the Abbé Georgel, 2 trunks, and his private library on the morning of the 3rd of June. He arrived at Chaise-Dieu before the end of the month. He lived through the next 3 years quietly, until the revolution drove him across the Rhine to Ettenheim, the small town on the German side of his old Strasbourg diocese, where he would die in his bed in the February of 1803, at the age of 69, having outlived the king who had banished him, the queen who had refused him, the parliament that had acquitted him, the Bastille that had held him, the monarchy that had clothed him in scarlet, and the republic that had not bothered to send for him. He had outlived everyone but his own remorse, which he carried into his 84th winter, in which, on the morning he died, was the only thing in the room with him besides the priest. Rétaux de Villette was sentenced to perpetual banishment from the kingdom. He left for Venice within the week and died there in 1797, of a quiet illness, in a room above a wine shop. Mademoiselle d'Oliva was acquitted. She left the Bastille on the 2nd of June, 1786, carrying her son. She was 23. She returned to the milliner's shop in the arcades of the Palais Royal for 1 month and was discharged because the proprietress did not wish to employ a woman who had testified in a celebrated trial. She married, in the autumn of 1786, a clerk of the Palais Royal named Beausier, who acknowledged her son and gave the child his name. She died 3 years later, in the early summer of 1789, of a complication of childbed at the birth of her second child, who did not survive either. She was 26. She was buried in the parish cemetery of Saint-Sulpice. The grave was not marked. Jean Guillaumat was sentenced to be flogged, branded on each shoulder with the letter V, voleuse, thief, and imprisoned for life at the Salpêtrière. The sentence was carried out at 6 in the morning on the 21st of June, 1786, on the steps of the Conciergerie in the presence of the executioner Sanson, 2 officers of the Parlement, and a small crowd that had begun to gather at 4. Jeanne resisted. She had not been informed that the sentence included the brand. She had been informed only of the flogging. When the executioner approached her with the iron, she screamed. She tore at the men holding her. She bit one of them in the forearm, hard enough to draw blood. The iron was applied twice, once correctly to the right shoulder, once incorrectly to the left breast, because she had thrown herself sideways at the moment of application. She lost consciousness immediately afterwards. She was taken in a sealed cart to the Salpêtrière at 6:20, while a small footman of the cardinal's household, who had been sent to observe and report, stood in the crowd in plain clothes, and afterwards walked back to the Rue Vieille du Temple, and was sick in the courtyard. She did not remain at the Salpêtrière. On the night of the 5th of August, 1787, she escaped from her cell wearing the habit of a Carmelite novice. The escape had been arranged at a cost of 720 livres by a man whose name has never been established, and who has been variously identified by historians and by Bachaumont, and by no one in particular, as a former lover, a current creditor, an agent of Cagliostro, an agent of the Comte de Provence, and the sympathetic priest. The Carmelite habit has never been recovered. She crossed to England within a fortnight. She arrived in London at the end of August. She settled in modest lodgings on the south side of the river with what she had managed to save before her arrest, which was, by her own later account in the Memoires Justificatifs, she published in Paris through a London intermediary in 1789, sufficient to live 4 years in modest circumstances. She did not live 4 years, she lived 4. On the night of the 23rd of August, 1791, in those lodgings in a quiet London street, she was confronted by 2 bailiffs on a writ of debt brought by a London creditor. There was a quarrel. There was a flight up the stairs. There was, finally, a fall from a second-story window onto the iron railings below. She lingered for 5 weeks. She died on the 23rd of September. The English newspapers reported the death briefly. The French newspapers, which by the autumn of 1791 were occupied with other matters, did not mention it. Marie Antoinette was tried in the same Grande Chambre by the Revolutionary Tribunal, 7 years after the cardinal had been acquitted in it. She was tried on the 14th of October, 1793, by a court that had inherited the paneled room and the wooden bench and the same lectern at which Mademoiselle d'Oliva had stood, and had inherited nothing else. The tribunal called 18 witnesses. It did not call any witness from the affair of the necklace. It did not need to. The matter had been settled in the minds of the men of the tribunal on the morning the necklace was reported, on the steps of the Conciergerie, when the Cardinal of France in his red was acquitted of having signed for 1,600,000 livres on her behalf. And when the public, the Parisians on the parvis, the lawyers in the wine shops, the pamphleteers along the Pont Neuf, had begun to say openly, on the strength of nothing but the acquittal itself, that there must after all have been some understanding between her and the cardinal that the Parliament had been too polite to expose. The verdict in the Grand Chambre of 1786 was, by the verdict in the Grand Chambre of 1793, the same verdict drawn out by 7 years. The cardinal had been the warning. The queen was the lesson. She was condemned at 4 in the morning of the 16th of October. She was guillotined at 12:15 in the afternoon of the same day, in the Place de la Révolution. She was 37. In the same autumn, in the Rue de l'Ourcine, in the lower part of the parish of Saint-Marcel, an elderly woman who had been the wet nurse of Mademoiselle d'Oliva's son, and who had, since his mother's death 4 years before, kept the boy as her own, opened a small painted wooden box that the dead girl had left her. The box contained 2 louis, a thin gold chain that had belonged to the mother of the dead girl, a paper certificate of the acquittal of one Marie Nicole Leguay by the Parliament of Paris, dated the 2nd of June, 1786, and, in the lower compartment, a single dried rose, brown, with the stem broken, that the elderly woman did not recognize, and that she set aside, on the kitchen shelf, with the intention of asking the boy, when he was old enough to ask, whether he knew its meaning. He did not know its meaning. He would never know its meaning. He would grow up to be a saddler in a quarter that no longer exists, and would die in his 50s, in 1841, having never traveled within 50 miles of Versailles. The cardinal kept on his desk, in his last years across the Rhine at Ettenheim, a small enamel miniature of himself at 30. He had had it returned to him by Georgel by a confidential route, 18 years after he had laid it down on the wet grass of the Bosquet de Venus on the night of the 11th of August, 1784. He looked at it sometimes in the evenings. He was the only man in Europe who knew where, precisely, it had once lain. Bachaumont, who had written about the trial daily in his Memoirs Secrets for the full 9 months of the proceedings, never mentioned the miniature. Saint-Simon was a century dead, and had been spared the necessity of writing about any of them. The Memoirs of the Comtesse de Genlis mention Mademoiselle d'Oliva once, in a footnote, and call her by the wrong Christian name. The Bosquet de Venus is still at Versailles. The clipped hedges have been replanted 4 times since the night of the 11th of August, 1784. The basin of Apollo has been drained and refilled. The undergardener, who let 2 women through the lower gate for 12 livres, has been dead 240 years. The necklace was never reassembled. The small leather pouches were sold off, in London, in the months after Jean's flight, by 3 different fences, to 21 different buyers, in cities ranging from Amsterdam to Naples. The 647 stones are now distributed untraceably in private collections, in royal jewelry, in single rings in shop windows, and in the linings of vanished coats. The largest of them, a single brilliant of 23 carats, was seen at a London auction in 1867, and then was not seen again. The receipt the cardinal signed on the 1st of February, 1785, approuvé, Marie Antoinette de France, was preserved among the papers of the affair and survives among the documents read out at his trial. The signature, examined in close light, is in his own unmistakable hand. The 3 words at the end of it were never written by the Queen of France, who, having been buried twice and exhumed twice, and reburied at last in the Basilica of Saint Denis, never wrote them in her life, and is, in the small mercy that remains to her, no longer able to be blamed for them. If you have read with me this far, the next of these will find you. They come slowly. They take the time they take. Subscribe, and you will not have to look for them. A last image. On a winter morning in 1793, in a kitchen on the Rue de l'Ourcine, an old woman lifted from a shelf a small brown rose with a broken stem, looked at it for a moment, and put it back. The boy who would inherit it slept in the next room. He was 3. He would grow up. He would forget. He would die in 1841 in a quarter that no longer exists, and the rose would by then have been thrown away. It had been the most consequential rose in the history of the French court. None of the four people who had ever known it had survived to say so. None of them had been able to. The court at Versailles, by then, did not exist either.